The movie kicks off with this guy. We don't know his name at this point, except that he's driving his kid across town. He's gonna drop his kid off at his mother-in-law's, and is all set to go be a superhero husband for his pregnant wife, to give her some of that emotional support that women need during labor. Finally, they reach their destination, and his wife's mother takes over the kiddo watch duty. He tells the kid to be a good boy, and then makes his way back to the car and drives off. A few minutes later, while he is driving, his wife calls in, moaning in pain as she talks to him. He tells her that he just dropped their kid off at her mother's place, and now we learn that this guy's name is David. David tells his wife that he's almost at the hospital, and soon enough, he makes it to the hospital. Just as he arrives at the parking lot, a weird red-haired guy in a tuxedo suddenly hops in the car, pulls out a gun, and asks him to drive. David is as lost as a clown at a funeral, and to be fair, any other person in his shoes would be as confused. He tells the red-haired man that he has a family emergency, because his wife is about to have a baby and he has to be with her. In response, the dude barks that he is now his family emergency. David has no choice but to do as he's told, so he obeys the guy's instruction and drives out of the hospital parking lot. Now in situations like this, you'll agree that it's just best to play along, throw a pity party, and pray to your goddamn stars that they listen. And that's exactly what David tries to do. But before David can even speak, Mr. Redhead catches on to it, and makes it clear to David that he isn't going to fall for any cliché family pep talk. While all this is going on, David's wife calls again. But this time, he doesn't answer for obvious reasons. Moments later, Mr. Redhead peeps at the gas gauge, and sees that David is pretty low on gas. So, they pull over at a gas station to fill up the tank. David sees this as his cue to cry for help, and luckily for him, there's a woman at the gas station. The only problem here is that if David is going to get any help from her, he has to do it without Redhead noticing. David is able to successfully mouth "help me" a few times, but Redhead catches him. The woman, on the other hand, doesn't do anything because she's either too scared or too confused to make out what David is trying to say. It turns out to be the latter, as she practically runs into her car, and drives off when Redhead looks towards her direction. As for Dave, he has no choice but to get back into the car after his first cry for help ends up in failure. They hit the road again, and while still pointing a gun at David, Mr. Redhead reaches for the glove compartment and brings out some pictures. Redhead asks if David's ever been to Boston, to which David replies that he has been to Boston just once, and that it was a long time ago. After this, Redhead tells him that he reminds him of a guy he used to know in Boston. A few moments later, David decides to ask Redhead how long it would take before he can return home. At first, Redhead asks David why he thinks he would ever go back home, but he retracts and tells David that their entire trip should last for about an hour. He also tells David their destination is Boulder City. Just then, David's wife calls again, and this time, he picks up the phone. But she sounds like she's in even more pain, so David assures her that he'll be with her in a bit, and the call ends. Moments later, Dave sees a cop vehicle, and this time, he has a plan. The plan is to drive past the cop fast enough to attract a chase for exceeding the speed limit. And guess what? It worked like magic. The police car gives them a good chase, and soon enough, they have no choice but to pull over. However, things don't go as planned, and what happened next will send chills down your spine. As soon as the cop asks them to step out of the car.
Please, Mr. Big Policeman.
Step out of the car.
Just do what he says,
No.
okay?
Redhead pulls the trigger, and the cop falls to the ground. It is at this point that David realizes he's in for the craziest night of his entire life. They too hit the road again, and after driving for a while, David starts to cook up another escape plan. At first, he tries to distract Redhead with questions, but Redhead simply brushes them off. Shortly after, Redhead suspects that David is about to crash the car on purpose. So, he undoes Dave's seatbelt, to make him feel the impact more, just in case he tried to do anything stupid. But instead of crashing the car, David jumps out of the moving car in a split second. Unfortunately, the redhead guy manages to bring the car to a stop, but not without a busted nose. David hides behind a rock, while Red curses at Dave for playing a fast one on him, but he's interrupted by Dave's wife. This time, Redhead answers the call, and disguises as the storekeeper in the hospital. He also asks what her room number is. At this point, David realizes that he has to stop playing hide and seek, as the last thing Redhead wants to do is put his family in danger. Redhead reacts to this by punching David so hard in the face that he falls to the ground. As they approach the car, David makes a quick adjustment to his collarbone, which is a bit surprising for Redhead that a loser like David could do something like that. Once that's sorted, they hop back into the car, with David back at the wheel. Worried about his wife, Dave asks Redhead how she sounded over the phone. Redhead says that she sounded nice over the phone, and asks David if he is happy in his marriage, to which David replies that he is. Soon after, Redhead sights a diner, and asks Dave to drive there, and David complies without any objections. Once they get to the diner, the two men walk into the diner, and Redhead orders David to sit down. He looks around, and sees a waitress and a man staring at him. While holding the gun under the table, Redhead tells David that a man is waiting for his arrival. He says that the initial plan was to go all the way to Boston, but because the man was impatient, he flew out to a private suite in Boulder City, and that is where they are heading to. David gets lost in his thoughts, probably trying to make any sense of what his kidnapper just said. Redhead then goes on to tell him the story of a bookkeeper. According to Redhead, the bookkeeper is a man from Brooklyn who was living in South Boston. The bookkeeper meets a nice Bostonian girl, falls in love, they tie the knot, and have a baby girl. But before Redhead completes his story, he notices the waitress approach them. They both order black coffee and sandwiches, and David is annoyed that the cook won't let them change anything on the menu. After the waitress leaves, Redhead continues his bookkeeper story. He says that the bookkeeper was working for a hard-drinking Catholic named Jacob Sullivan. His job at that time was to do the books for one of Sullivan's associates, but the associate tries to play smart, and starts skimming money on the side. So when Jacob Sullivan found out about it, Sullivan sent a man to kill the associate, who came over to the bookkeeper's apartment. Redhead then starts to talk about how happy David's life is, and this makes David ask who Redhead thinks he is. When Dave interrupts him again, this throws Redhead over edge, and he barks at David, telling him never to interrupt him. The other man in the diner tries to make an exit, and Redhead also barks at him to sit back down. In one swift motion, Redhead cuffs David's hand to the table. He walks up to the other man, tells him to stay, and takes his phone away from him. He also walks to the kitchen where the waitress and cook are. He takes their phone away, and throws it in the deep fryer. He gives the cook 4 minutes to get his food ready, and then walks out of the kitchen with the waitress. After which he changes the music playing, and starts to sing along and dance back to the table with David. He sits across from David, and tells David that he has to tell the entire truth, or everyone else dies. David says he has no idea what he's talking about, right when a woman walks into the diner with her daughter. Moments later, the waitress comes back out with their food, and Redhead decides to shoot at her since Dave isn't ready to tell the truth. He tries to pull his gun at the waitress, but
Fucked up right now, you fucked up.
Redhead pulls the trigger again, and the bullet hits the diner man, who drops to the ground. He then walks over to the woman and her daughter, and points the gun at them. It is at this point that David decides to come clean, because he doesn't want innocent people dying for something they know nothing about. He tells Redhead what he has been dying to hear: he's really who Redhead thinks he is. Hearing this, Redhead walks up to him, throws him to the ground, and punches him repeatedly until he's a bloody mess. Redhead looks him dead in the eye and calls him James. Redhead leaves him on the floor, walks to the back of the diner, and shoots the cook who was trying to run away. He also goes to the bathroom where the waitress is hiding, but he doesn't shoot her, and decides to just walk back out. Meanwhile, David manages to call 911, and tries to free himself from the handcuff. Redhead walks to the kitchen, and sets the gas cooker on fire, even throws a bottle of liquor at it to make the fire bigger. Redhead then comes back out and shoots at David, who has just freed himself and is making his way to the door. The bullet hits his leg, but he doesn't stop running. As soon as he gets out, he hides behind a car, and puts his belt right above the bullet wound to help him stop the bleeding. Redhead runs after him to the parking lot of the diner, where he begins to set cars on fire in an attempt to scare David. He also knows that David can hear him, so he continues his bookkeeper story again. From his story, we finally learn that Redhead is actually the bookkeeper, and the problem is that his wife witnessed the execution of Sullivan's associate in their apartment. After that traumatic incident, Redhead's wife lost her mind when she tried to erase the memory from her mind. When she failed to do so, she started telling the tale to anyone who would listen to her, and that's when a man named James stepped in. Just then, David ambushes Redhead from behind, and the two get in an intense fight, with David having the upper hand. To distract David, Redhead yells David's wife's room number, and it works. After Redhead punches David in the face, he promises he'll stay away from David's wife and child if he cooperates, and he orders David to go back to his car with him. Moments after driving, David asks Redhead what happened to his wife. Redhead then continues his story. His wife had become a serious threat to Jacob Sullivan, and Sullivan had asked the bookkeeper, aka Redhead himself, to get rid of her before she could do anything stupid. Of course David wouldn't do this, and as a result, Jacob Sullivan brought in a man named James, a hitman, who fixed things for the rich. It is at this point that we learn that David and James are actually the same person, but David still doesn't want to confess. The bookkeeper found out David's whereabouts and has been watching him since. We also find out that Redhead has lung cancer and knows his time is almost up, and this is why he doesn't mind killing anyone who gets in his way. Shortly after, we hear sirens, and see the police giving them a chase. Redhead decides to kill David then and there, but before he pulls the trigger. We then see two police officers stop by. But suddenly, someone shoots them. And that someone is David, who we now know to be James. He makes it out of the car and goes over to Redhead, who was stuck in the other side of the car. Here James finally confesses that he didn't mean to kill Redhead's family. Back to the story. In the bookkeeper's absence, James entered the house and tried to shoot his wife, but the bookkeeper's wife attacked him, causing him to accidentally shoot the daughter. James regretted pulling the trigger, but he had already committed the sin from which he wouldn't be able to redeem himself. He shot the wife and set the entire house on fire. However, the entire incident weighed heavily on James' conscience, which was why he left the world of crime behind, and moved on to another city to lead a simple life. After his confession, he strangles Redhead till he stops struggling. Redhead is dead. After Mr. Redhead dies, David picks his phone again, and finds out that his wife had a baby girl. We hear sirens again and see another police cars approaching. In the end, David raises his hands above his head, and will probably just go back to his simple, happy life.